Grounded flights, canceled sporting events, recess indoors, iconic skylines made barely visible, and for many, a return to masking up. It was a week where the quality of the air we breathe became an issue that was impossible to ignore. The blanket of smoke caused by wildfires stretched from parts of Canada across the northeastern U.S. and beyond, according to scientists, all the way to Norway. This weekend brought some improvement, depending on where you are. With hundreds of wildfires still burning across the country, Dr. Melissa Lem says there is still cause for concern, both about the impact to our health and the role climate change is playing in all of this. Dr. Lem is the president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and a family physician in Vancouver. Dr. Lem, good morning and welcome to the Sunday Magazine.
Good morning, David. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Well, we're glad to have you. We've heard from many people over the past few days that wildfire smoke, bad for your health, it turns out. What about long-term health?
Well, we know a lot about the short-term health effects of exposure to wildfire smoke and air pollution. We know less about the longer-term effects of wildfire smoke because it's an evolving story here in Canada. We have never been exposed to summer after summer of smoke like we have, especially on the West Coast here over the last 5 to 10 years. This year so far, Canada has burned about 13 times more area than what typically burns in a season. And it takes several years for us to start to see the long-term effects, especially for people in, say, Ontario and the Maritimes and Quebec who aren't used to the wildfire smoke. So there is, though, some emerging evidence from studies on the West Coast because we have been seeing some major wildfires since about 2003. So there's a study on people in Montana who were exposed to just 2 to 3 weeks of severe smoke in 1 year. And it showed that their worst lung function lasted for up to 2 years afterwards. And there was also a study recently published in Lancet Planetary Health looking at, in fact, cancer risk in people exposed to smoke over about 3 decades. And it showed that if they lived within about 30 miles of wildfire smoke, of forest fires, that they had significantly higher rates of brain tumors and lung cancer. But I will say that something we do have a lot of evidence about are the effects of air pollution on people's health. And wildfire smoke is a classic example of that air pollution. So over the long run, we know repeated exposure to this causes systemic inflammation, which leads to cancer, heart disease, lung disease, worse pregnancy outcomes, and worse developmental outcomes. It affects essentially every single system in the body. And babies and children might be especially affected by repeated smoke exposure because their bodies and lungs are still developing.
What actually happens to the bodies and lungs?
Well, in the short term, when you breathe in things that are burning in general, that's bad for your health. So whether it's cigarettes, whether it's indoor air pollution from gas stoves, or even wood smoke from a campfire, this is bad because when things burn, they release air pollution. So with wildfires in particular, the kind of air pollution we most worry about is called PM 2.5 or fine particulate matter because this enters our bloodstream and it can get right into our tissues, which causes inflammation and direct oxidative stress, which can lead to cell death and all kinds of negative effects. So there's a massive amount of research on the health detriments of those short-term effects. So you think about the effects from the point of entry. So the first symptoms we often see are respiratory. First, you can get that kind of runny nose, sore throat, eye irritation, and then often headaches I see in my patients. And then we start to see more systemic effects. So there was a study done at UBC published in the last couple years that showed that within just 1 hour of smoke exposure, there were significantly more ambulance calls for both heart and lung disease. And then within 48 hours, you saw more calls for diabetes exacerbations because of the fact probably that people were staying indoors to be protected from the smoke and also that inflammation. And then we also have to remember that wildfires don't only burn down trees, as we unfortunately saw in Atlantic Canada this past week. Wildfires also burn houses and cars and other human-made infrastructure, which can generate all kinds of other airborne toxins.
Yeah, depending on what's in those houses, of course. And I know we think often about our lungs, but there's another component here about our well-being, and there's this term eco-anxiety. Can you take me through that?
Sure. So eco-anxiety there are many definitions for that, but the definition I like is this sense of pervasive doom about what's happening in your environment and your future health and the future of climate change. And I have to say, within my own practice, aside from the respiratory effects that I've seen during wildfire smoke events, mental health is the second biggest problem. So I still can think back to early in the pandemic I thought when all the lockdown measures were put in place that I would be seeing a lot of calls for anxiety and depression. But that actually didn't happen until the wildfire smoke rolled in that summer when people didn't feel safe indoors or outdoors anymore. And so wildfire smoke is this tangible manifestation of climate change. It's kind of easy to ignore for a lot of people as you move through your everyday life because we don't see these gradual changes that are happening. But once it's in your face, once you can smell it, once you can see it, and as you mentioned, those iconic land horizons like the CN Tower are blocked out, it's impossible to ignore. And so people start to worry about their own health. They start to worry about their kids' health. They start to worry about the future. There's research within Canada showing that the majority of youth in Canada have negative climate emotions like climate anxiety and grief. And in fact, a lot of them are even contemplating not having children because of how much they worry about the future. And that especially is something I see as heartbreaking because kids have played basically no role in causing climate change, yet they're going to be among the ones who will see the worst of its effects.
You talk about kids, and I've got to think, of course, about recess, which in Toronto got canceled for at least one day this week. And I don't want to focus exclusively on Toronto because, yes, Southern Ontario, large parts of Ontario faced a very bad week, but British Columbia and Alberta have seen them too and are likely to see them again. We see what's happening in the Maritimes. We see how it has happened right across the country. But when the effect of that is what you see in places like Dubai and Delhi that are known for very poor air quality, if the effect of that is that more people choose to not spend time outside, there's an implication to that as well.
You're right, David. So I actually help run a national nature prescription program, which says that spending time outside in nature and time outdoors in general should be one of the 4 essential pillars of health, just as important as healthy diet, exercise, and sleep at maintaining a healthy lifestyle. And when we're cut off from our neighborhood outdoor places, this causes problems with our physical and mental health. So I have to say I was actually feeling pretty guilty this week. Typically in BC, here in the Lower Mainland, we have smoke events, but as the rest of the country was burning, as the rest of the country was exposed to smoke, we actually had pretty good air quality. And I was thinking about those kids in Toronto, where I grew up, actually, in Ottawa. I've spent about 3 decades of my life in Ontario, even though I live in BC right now. And just thinking about how heartbreaking it was that these kids and their parents have to think about walking around with masks outdoors or staying indoors. And so when you spend time inside, you don't get exposure to those healthy physical activity effects. You can't moderate your mental health like you often can do when you spend time in outdoor environments. And spending time outside as opposed to being exposed to wildfire smoke, which is essentially the negative opposite of that, and spending time indoors also boosts all kinds of other types of health, like it improves prenatal health, improves cancer care, improves cardiovascular health and lung health, and also cholesterol numbers even. So by spending time indoors, we're being deprived of all those positive health effects that spending time outside can give us.
Now, of course, it's not just wildfire smoke that's causing pollution in the air. The air quality is impacted by many other things. What do you want policymakers to be thinking about and focusing on as they take stock of what we've seen over the past week, not just with wildfires, but with what the wildfires are on top of in terms of pollution?
Do you know what's really interesting, David, is we've kind of exchanged one major air quality issue for another. So in fact, over the last few decades, overall air quality in Canada, when we haven't been exposed to wildfire smoke, is improving. And a lot of the reason for that is because of the phase out of coal-fired electricity across the country, which causes major air pollution. So in general, Canada has been making some strides on that file, but unfortunately, the effects of climate change have started to come home to roost. And over the next 50 years or so, we're probably, because of the amount of carbon pollution we've already let into the air, that we'll see at least 2 to 3 times the number of wildfires. And what's driving this, of course, is fossil fuel combustion. So when the World Health Organization named air pollution the greatest environmental risk to health in 2019, it went hand in hand with climate change. And in fact, across Canada, it's estimated that over 30,000 people per year die prematurely because of air pollution driven by fossil fuel combustion. So CAPE, actually, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, with the help of Minister of Parliament John Aldag here in BC, actually launched a parliamentary petition on Clean Air Day, which is ironic. Last week, June 7th was Clean Air Day, and across the country, we saw some of the worst air quality we'd ever seen. But to end fossil fuel advertising within Canada, because not only do we have to stop establishing new fossil fuel infrastructure and ending fossil fuel subsidies to stop pouring fuel on that fire, but we have to reduce demand. So we're calling for a ban on all advertising by fossil fuel companies, also advertising of fossil fuel internal combustion vehicles, so that consumers will stop wanting those things that are also polluting the air and driving climate change.
All right, Dr. Lem, we'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Dr. Melissa Lem is a physician and the president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment.